15. Deah Hall. Deah Hall was just a teenager when she was first introduced to drugs. It all began when she pumped a pain pill while partying with a friend. At the time, it seemed harmless enough, but the Arizona native quickly became addicted, and her habits soon escalated to the point where she was essentially taking a small handful of pills at a time several times a day. Hall's addiction was still going strong 3 years later when she went on methadone in an attempt to kick the habit. She was then kicked out of the clinic after the death of a family friend caused her to miss her appointments, and she decided to try quitting drugs cold turkey. However, the withdrawal was unbearable, and she became so desperate for relief that she followed a friend's advice to stave off the sickness with a small amount of heroin. The young woman instantly fell in love with the high, so much so that she couldn't get enough of it. Her drug use only escalated from there. She began using methamphetamine and injecting both heroin and meth. And Hall would later tell the Daily Mail that her addiction became so severe that she stopped caring about who she hurt. It was all about chasing that high. Deah's downward spiral finally ground to a halt after a visit to her dying grandfather in 2012. At the time, her weight had dropped to just 95 pounds, and it was obvious that she was unwell. Her heartbroken grandfather said that he was hurt by the changes in Hall's behavior and the fact that he hardly ever saw her anymore. Then, later that night, Hall was arrested on a drug charge. During her final conversation with her grandfather, before she went to jail, she promised to stop doing drugs. He passed away while Hall was serving her sentence, and she remained dedicated to keeping her promise. After serving her time and leaving jail sober, Hall became a minister and had a daughter. She stayed off drugs and embraced her new lifestyle. And in 2016, she marked her 4th year sober by posting photos of her transformation from active addiction to thriving in recovery. The story went viral, serving as an inspiration for others who were struggling with substance abuse. Hall's experiences are also a reminder that it is possible for someone to rise up from rock bottom, no matter how hard it may seem. 14. Amber Chauncey. During what began as a routine traffic stop in Escambia County, Florida in August 2023, deputies found over 100 grams of methamphetamine in a vehicle being driven by 29-year-old Amber Chauncey, along with other illegal narcotics. They arrested the young woman on suspicion of cocaine possession, trafficking methamphetamine, and 2 counts of possession of a controlled substance without a prescription. The arrest came just a few months after Chauncey was accused of trafficking drugs out of her home. During a search of the residence where Chauncey lived with her children and 2 roommates, police found nearly 70 grams of methamphetamine, 7 grams of fentanyl, and a small amount of LSD and marijuana, along with scales and a credit card covered in suspected drug residue. Investigators also obtained a warrant to search Chauncey's phone and found conversations about drug prices and amounts, further leading them to believe that the young woman was dealing. Chauncey was eventually freed on a $151,000 bond and went on to catch another charge for having a controlled substance without a prescription just weeks later. She paid a $1,000 bond and was released once again, only to get into more legal trouble when she was caught with the meth stash the following month. Jail records show that Chauncey has been arrested at least 14 times since 2013, with 7 of the arrests involving drug charges. 13. Eric Thomas. In September 2023, a 33-year-old Florida man named Eric Thomas called the police and reported that someone had stolen $10 from him while he was trying to sell a bag of marijuana. According to law enforcement, responding officers found 11 bags of marijuana, totaling 40 grams in Thomas's pocket, along with 2 packets of cocaine in his wallet. It's unclear whether Thomas realized that possessing and selling recreational marijuana was a crime in Florida, where a medical permit is required for legal use. But it's likely safe to assume that he wasn't in the right frame of mind, and that he may have sampled his own product before attempting to sell it that night. Thomas was arrested on felony counts of possession of marijuana with intent to distribute and possession of cocaine. As of November 2023, he remains in custody at the Pinellas County Jail on a $7,000 bond. Records also list him as a transient. According to ESPN South Florida, Thomas was convicted of marijuana, cocaine, and battery charges in the year leading up to his most recent arrest. He also has a pending criminal case for allegedly pulling 7 baggies of marijuana from his pockets at a courthouse security checkpoint. Thomas had placed the goods onto a plastic tray where visitors are required to place their belongings before an X-ray scan. 12. Scott Jenkinson. In November 2015, 32-year-old Scott Jenkinson collapsed in the lobby of a hotel in the English town of Rugeley. And inside his backpack, police found £12,000 worth of cocaine packed into bags for street-level sales, as well as a large amount of cash, scales, and other drug-dealing supplies. Jenkinson had overdosed on his own product, and the items found during the emergency response triggered an investigation into his illicit business. Detectives uncovered a cocaine selling ring involving at least 6 people, including Jenkinson, who was accused of masterminding the operation. 3 of the suspects worked as street dealers, while another member managed the group's stash houses. During the investigation, detectives observed members of the group selling drugs on the street and turning the profits over to Jenkinson. The accused co-conspirators were arrested in 2016 after being implicated for their roles in the business. Police found even more drugs, cash, and equipment, as well as cell phones and a safe during the arrests and subsequent searches of the suspects' homes. According to prosecutors, the gang sold somewhere between £750,000 and £1.2 million of cocaine over a 2-year period starting in 2014. Had it not been for Jenkinson's overdose triggering suspicion in the first place, there's no telling how long the group would have continued to operate. All 6 defendants pleaded guilty to conspiracy to supply cocaine, and as a result, they received prison sentences ranging from 3 to 7 years, with Jenkinson receiving the longest term. 11. Billy Joe Palomo. Billy Joe Palomo has a lengthy rap sheet and a history of drug abuse dating at least as far back as 2008, when he was convicted of possessing methamphetamine with the intent to distribute it in the U.S. territory of Guam. As a consequence, he was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. Shortly after his release in 2018, Palomo's probation was revoked for using methamphetamine and failing to comply with the drug treatment program. According to the Guam Daily Post, he failed several drug tests and had also recently been charged with drug possession. Palomo was taken into custody after a relative called the police and reported that he'd barricaded himself inside her home. He surrendered without incident after officers entered the house, but appeared to be hearing voices that weren't there. During a search, the police found a glass pipe covered in residue hidden inside a balled-up shirt. After serving another 6 months in prison, Palomo violated his probation again in 2019 by testing positive for methamphetamine. And this time, he was sentenced to 24 weekends in jail and 50 months of probation. Palomo's supervised release was revoked for a 3rd time, though, in early 2022, after he allegedly used meth on 2 separate occasions. He returned to prison for a few months and was caught using meth again shortly after his release. According to the Guam Daily Post, his probation officer told him that he posed a workplace hazard due to his drug use, but Palomo failed to pass the information on to his bosses at the heavy equipment company where he worked as a driver. In March 2023, Palomo went to the emergency room while suffering from a possible meth overdose. He tested positive for the drug and was soon transferred to the custody of U.S. Marshals, who took him to prison yet again. Records show that he was released in June of that year, but given the repeat offender's history, it may only be a matter of time before he ends up back behind bars. At this point, it seems as though Palomo is no longer dealing drugs, despite being hopelessly addicted to meth. Sadly, he just can't seem to kick his drug habit, and it seems to keep getting the better of him, even though it keeps landing him behind bars. 10. Joe Don Chitwood. In April 2022, agents from the Oklahoma Bureau of Narcotics received a tip that a small-town police chief was both using and selling methamphetamine in Hughes County. During the month-long investigation that ensued, 42-year-old Calvin Police Chief Joe Don Chitwood allegedly sold $20 worth of meth to an informant. A subsequent search of his home turned up a small amount of the drug, and authorities charged Chitwood with the distribution of a controlled dangerous substance. He then resigned from the police department shortly after his arrest. Home to little more than a Dollar General, a gas station, a food pantry, a few schools and a Baptist church, Calvin's a tiny town of just over 300 residents, so locals were shocked to learn about Chitwood's alleged crimes. Speaking with the Oklahoman, town attorney Lloyd Palmer said that if anyone had suspected the former top cop of this type of activity, it would have been stopped sooner. He said that the town would carry out its own investigation into Chitwood to determine whether his suspected drug use and dealing affected his on-the-job performance. If convicted as charged, Chitwood could face up to 7 years in prison and a fine of up to $100,000. Unfortunately though, there have been no updates since the story first broke, and the current status of the case is unclear. 9. Alexandra Moss. Faced with the mounting costs of an out-of-control cocaine habit, an Australian socialite named Alexandra Moss first turned to prostitution to support her habit. And by the time she started selling the drug out of her apartment in Sydney in 2021, the 27-year-old's addiction was costing her between $1,000 and $1,500 per day. After becoming suspicious of the young woman's involvement in the illicit trade, police searched her home and discovered photos of her posing for the camera with large amounts of cocaine, marijuana, GHB, and cash. They also found conversations about her drug-selling activities between her associates and customers. During a subsequent raid of Moss's home, law enforcement seized over 1 kilo of cocaine and bottles filled with GBL, a compound similar to the party drug GHB, which had been delivered to the residence in a 25-liter jug. According to authorities, Moss admitted to dealing the cocaine, but claimed that the GBL belonged to a friend and fellow drug dealer. However, police also found 5 grams of MDMA and 3 grams of methamphetamine. For the cocaine supply, she pleaded guilty to 1 count of supplying a large commercial quantity of a prohibited drug. She also pleaded guilty to 1 count of supplying a prohibited drug for the GHB. In court, Moss's defense attorney blamed her drug-selling activities on her cocaine habit, which he attributed to Moss's attempts to self-medicate her undiagnosed ADHD symptoms. Describing his client as vulnerable, he also blamed his client's addiction on the people who'd allegedly introduced her to drugs 10 years earlier. The lawyer pointed out that Moss didn't act out of greed. In fact, she hadn't profited at all from selling drugs because most of the money she made went directly toward financing her addiction. Moss's attorney urged the judge to spare Moss from jail time, arguing that her reputation as an heiress would put her in danger behind bars. He also mentioned how his client had gone to rehab and successfully kicked her drug habit, was working full-time, and had recently gotten her college degree. The judge acknowledged the legitimacy of Moss's struggles and her efforts to get her life on track, but noted that in the process of getting her own coke fix under control, she damaged multiple people's lives by peddling the highly addictive drug. He concluded that prison time was appropriate for the severity of Moss's crimes and sentenced her to 2 years behind bars. 8. Jerry Martin. In early 2023, the Canadian province of British Columbia decriminalized the possession of opioids, cocaine, methamphetamine, and MDMA. The decision came as part of an ongoing effort to reduce the negative stigma against drug users and help make treatment more accessible. Under the new policy, it remains illegal to possess more than 2.5 grams of a personal supply, and it's against the law to sell drugs. A 51-year-old Vancouver resident named Jerry Martin apparently missed this detail in the fine print though, when he announced his plans to open a store selling heroin, cocaine, and other drugs. Martin, who preferred to call himself a drug activist rather than an addict, told reporters that his goal was to provide users with a guaranteed safe supply of products, which he believed would help combat the sky-high number of fatal overdoses in British Columbia amid an ongoing drug crisis. He predicted that ODs would increase following decriminalization, especially among younger, less experienced users. The province's Ministry of Health and Addictions told CBS News that it didn't support Martin's plans, which it described as not within the scope of decriminalization. And when asked how he planned to guarantee the safety and quality of his inventory, Martin said that he knew someone who owned a purity testing device. In the meantime, experts continued to caution the public that there's no way to guarantee the safety of illicit drugs. Martin was part of a growing movement campaigning for the availability of safe drugs. Most activists would like these substances to be sourced from a government-regulated pharmaceutical supplier. In the meantime, though, some individuals and organizations have started testing drugs for purity and selling products that are deemed safe to customers. One group, known as the Drug User Liberation Front, DULF, sells tested drugs to users who are at a high risk of overdosing. The organization's goal is to keep people with drug habits as safe as possible to ensure the highest possible quality of life. And since starting its Compassion Club, DULF claims that none of its members have overdosed. But Martin's business plan and testing methods were far less sophisticated, so he was arrested less than a day after opening his mobile dispensary in May of 2023. Law enforcement shut him down, and he was met with continued challenges as he tried to turn his one-stop drug shop into a reality. Unfortunately, less than 2 months later in early July, Martin fatally overdosed on fentanyl. Emergency responders and doctors did everything in their power to try saving him, but a CT scan showed that he'd suffered major brain damage. A few days later, his loved ones made the heart-wrenching decision to take him off life support. Martin's girlfriend, Krista Thomas, told CBC reporters that opioids weren't Jerry's drug of choice. She said that he was meticulous about testing his drugs, leading her to wonder if this was the one time he decided to forego his routine. But she wasn't there when the overdose happened, and she must now grapple with the realization that she'll never truly know what led up to Martin's final, fateful decision. 7. Brian Kenyan. In September 2022, a 30-year-old woman named Stevie Main was abducted in Bennington, Vermont, and driven to Springfield, Massachusetts, where she was held captive over a drug debt that her boyfriend owed to his dealer. The kidnappers refused to return Main until Brian Kenyan repaid the $1,500 balance he'd accrued due to his addiction. Someone alerted law enforcement to the situation, and an individual working with the police told Main's abductors that they'd receive the money if they returned the woman to Bennington. Officers were waiting when an Uber pulled up with the suspects and the victim inside. The alleged captors, 31-year-old Maurice Edwards and 30-year-old Jacqueline Valdez, fled on foot and were arrested a short while later at a nearby apartment where they were accused of trespassing. Authorities charged the pair with kidnapping for ransom, unlawful trespass into an occupied building, cocaine possession, and fentanyl trafficking. While speaking with investigators, Brian Kenyan implicated a third and fourth suspect in the case. He claimed that 26-year-old Jason Simpson and a man nicknamed Biggs had forced him to start selling fentanyl and crack cocaine about 2 weeks before the kidnapping, after he failed to repay his $1,500 drug debt. But handing drugs to an addict and expecting the person to sell them without dipping their own hands into the stash isn't the most logical way to recoup owed money, and it's not exactly surprising that Kenyan failed to come up with the money. Kenyan told the police that Simpson and Biggs threatened to kill him and Main when they learned that he still couldn't repay his debt. He also accused the men of drugging him and taking him to Springfield for a period before his girlfriend's abduction. As the alleged mastermind of the plot, Simpson was charged with multiple felonies, including human trafficking for labor servitude, kidnapping for ransom, kidnapping for bodily injury, and aggravated assault. It appears as though Biggs was never arrested, and the current statuses of the cases against Edwards, Valdez, and Simpson are unclear. 6. Scott Peterson. 30-year-old Scottish drug dealer Scott Peterson was at the tail end of a months-long crime spree when he was found unresponsive on the street in the fall of 2016. Responding police officers found a bag of heroin at his feet. Peterson, a known drug dealer, had overdosed on his own supply, but luckily he survived. During a drug deal gone wrong months earlier, Peterson had been stabbed 7 times, and police discovered his heroin stash at the scene. Prosecutors would later allege that Peterson was stabbed over a drug debt. According to his lawyer, however, he was stabbed after he got greedy and helped himself to a drug stash that another dealer had asked him to hold on to. His attacker had found him passed out in an alleyway from an overdose. Peterson had also recently been caught stealing aftershave. On another occasion, he climbed into a police officer's home through her window and stole the contents of her purse. The woman overheard Peterson shuffling around inside the home and went to investigate. Peterson was in the process of fleeing when the homeowner discovered him. She attempted to chase him down, but he got away. Luckily though, a police canine tracked him down nearby after law enforcement arrived at the scene. When it came time to face the laundry list of allegations against him in court, Peterson admitted to his involvement in the heroin trade. And after considering the array of crimes he'd committed, the judge sent him back to prison to finish a previous 55-day sentence, followed by 2 other sentences totaling 3 years. 5. Jennifer Vaughn Culp. During the summer of 2012, police in St. Louis, Missouri responded to a Walmart store where a customer had reportedly been caught filling a stolen purse with makeup. And upon arriving at the scene, officers noticed a portable meth lab in the woman's bag. Also known as a shake and bake or a one pot, the device was actively cooking methamphetamine when the cops confiscated it from the suspect, who was later identified as 32-year-old Jennifer Vaughn Culp. Made from a soda bottle, these portable cookers simplify the meth manufacturing process, but are no less dangerous than conventional meth labs. As the drug cooks inside the bottle, the pressure of the gases inside builds. If there's a tear in the bottle, or the person making the meth fails to properly depressurize the device, it can easily blow up, catch fire, or leak dangerous vapors. Due to the risk of explosion, hundreds of customers were evacuated from the store, while a specialized task force team was summoned to deal with the hazardous contraption. No immediate arrests were made, but the investigation continued, and the store was reopened 2.5 hours later. Just 2 weeks later, Vaughn Culp was caught with another shake-and-bake device at a gas station just down the road from the Walmart store where the first incident occurred. This time, she was charged with multiple drug counts, including 5 felonies and 1 misdemeanor. Even to the untrained eye, it's not hard to identify the telltale signs of long-term methamphetamine abuse. A comparison of Vaughn Culp's Facebook photo and her more recent mugshots showed that addiction had taken a clear toll on her appearance. So one can only hope that she ditched the drugs and got her life back on track. 4. Desperate trio joins the drug trade. In 2022, 3 drug-addicted British men began working together as low-level street dealers to support their habits. 45-year-old Nathan Varley, 43-year-old Douglas Dixon, and 53-year-old Gary Brown peddled cocaine and heroin in the seaside town of Great Yarmouth until they got busted in early 2023. The first arrest came in late January after Dixon was seen selling drugs in an alleyway. During a search, police found baggies of cocaine and messages in Dixon's phone about his drug-selling activities. Then, less than 2 weeks later, Varley was caught with cocaine after officers spotted him in a known drug area and searched him. Just days after that, in early February, Dixon and Varley were pulled over while driving around together. Police found heroin hidden inside the vehicle and also seized the men's cash and cell phones. During a search of the phones, investigators identified Gary Brown as a third suspect in the drug-selling operation. In court, all 3 men blamed their addictions for their crimes. Varley's defense attorney attributed his client's drug habit to childhood trauma and recent family deaths, while Brown's lawyer said that his client had relapsed during a breakup after 6 years of sobriety. They both admitted to multiple drug charges and were each sentenced to 30 months in prison, while Dixon received a 3-year sentence for his role in the drug peddling scheme. 3. Heather Raybon. A Florida woman named Heather Raybon first started getting arrested for methamphetamine-related crimes during the early 2000s when she was in her 20s. In 2004, she was left permanently disfigured by third-degree burns after a meth lab she was operating exploded. Her face nearly melted off, and she was likely lucky to be alive, period. For many, if not most people, this type of life-changing event would serve as a motivation to stop cooking and using drugs. But Raybon continued getting arrested in the years following the accident, while undergoing multiple reconstructive surgeries to repair some of the damage to her face. In 2011, 7 years after the explosion, she was hit with a possession charge in Santa Rosa County. And later that year, the then 31-year-old was accused of making meth at a trailer home in Milton, Florida. Law enforcement originally went to the property to serve a warrant on a wanted fugitive named Brian Morden. They didn't find him, but Raybon and a man named William Hindle were at the property when the cops arrived. While searching the trailer, deputies noticed a distinct chemical odor that they recognized as the smell of a meth lab. Deputies found drug paraphernalia, meth-making ingredients, powder and liquid methamphetamine, and a mobile meth cooking device. Raybon and Hindle were arrested on suspicion of tracking methamphetamine, possession of felony drug equipment, and possession of chemicals for manufacturing meth. It's unclear what Heather's up to these days, but her recent Facebook photos show that her facial injuries have healed considerably. So, hopefully she was able to put this troubled chapter of her life behind her and move on to better things. 2. Dean Yernshire. In September 2022, officers from an organised crime task force in Bridgend, Wales, stopped and searched 48-year-old Dean Yernshire. They seized nearly 25 grams of cocaine, a cell phone, and £165 in cash. During a subsequent search of the suspect's home, police discovered another cell phone, 2 scales, and even more cash. Yernshire's cocaine use had recently spiraled out of control after a breakup. At the height of his addiction, he was spending upwards of £300 per day on the drug. Unable to afford his habit with the modest government stipend he was living on at the time, he turned to dealing. Yernshire was charged with possession with intent to supply, marking the latest on what seemed like an endless list of prior run-ins with the law. At the time of his arrest, he had 21 previous convictions under his belt, including 12 drug-related offenses and several crimes that landed him in the news. 15 years earlier, in 2007, Yernshire was found guilty of a fray after climbing into his girlfriend's home through her window and threatening her with a hammer. In another case that made headlines in 2008, he was convicted of assaulting and threatening to kill the same girlfriend during a booze and amphetamine-fueled rage. He was reportedly angry at the woman for not spending enough time with him when he shoved her into a fireplace and then locked her in the second-story bedroom. Thankfully, though, the victim managed to call for help by yelling out the window to a neighbor. A few months after Yernshire's drug arrest in 2022, he was accused of assaulting a man he believed his recent ex-girlfriend was dating. And by the time the drug case went to court, he'd received a 40-month prison sentence for the assault. Yernshire ultimately pleaded guilty to the possession with intent charge. Then, in April 2023, the judge sentenced him to 2 years in prison to be served consecutively to the assault sentence, amounting to just over 5 years behind bars. And now for number 1. But if you want to hear more bizarre and crazy stories, stay tuned after the video for some more content. 1. Karen Bemis. Many addicts turn to drug dealing to support their habit and make just enough money to cover the cost of their own supply. But Karen Bemis managed to turn a handsome profit from dealing meth, even as her use of the drug took over her life. Karen struggled with addiction for many years. Her drug use stemmed largely from childhood trauma and a lack of support, which forced her to deal with complicated emotions on her own at a young age. Then, everything changed when she ran into legal trouble that forced her to get clean and find a new profession. In early 2011, Karen and 5 others were arrested in a narcotics raid in Kings County, California. During the bust, police seized methamphetamine, guns, and cash. And 3 months later, she and a male suspect were caught with more than 24 bags of meth during a routine traffic stop. She was hit with multiple charges, including committing a felony while released on pending charges, violating probation, and 5 drug-related counts. During a search of the home Karen shared with the male suspect, police found a large amount of marijuana, several $1,000s in cash, and a detailed ledger containing information about past drug sales. Karen may not have realized it at the time, but her addiction had taken over her life, even if it didn't render her broke as it does for many. She would later tell the Hanford Sentinel that her meth use was causing her to slowly self-destruct and that she felt isolated. During the 2 years she spent behind bars for her crimes, Karen focused on turning her life around. She got sober and found a higher purpose through Christianity, and she walked out of jail a completely different person. Wanting to help others struggling with addiction, she became a drug and alcohol counselor. Today, she works as the executive director of a faith-based non-profit in Tulare, which offers emergency housing and assistance to the homeless, along with a longer-term sober living program, with a focus on helping residents obtain stable employment. During a 2023 interview with the Hanford Sentinel, Karen expressed gratitude for having the opportunity to help others and to no longer be involved in a business that causes harm.
Number 16. Clyde Fortu and Amanda Ziminski. In 2013, law enforcement in Staten Island, New York, accused a 26-year-old nurse named Amanda Ziminski and her fiancé, 29-year-old Clyde Fortu, of scamming 80 elderly patients out of a collective $675,000 by stealing their identities. According to prosecutors, Amanda stole pertinent files from her employer over a 5-year period and used that information to siphon victims' bank accounts dry, open fraudulent credit cards, and file tax returns without their knowledge. The couple bragged over Facebook posts about the lavish purchases they made with their money, which included expensive cars, parties at upscale clubs, courtside basketball tickets, field-level seats to Jets games, diamond Rolex watches, and tropical vacations. They even got engaged at Cinderella's castle during a Disney World trip that their victims unknowingly paid for. In a post announcing their engagement, Amanda gushed about how she truly felt like she was living in a fairy tale. Meanwhile, her patients' pockets were dry. The pair also bragged about scoring better NBA playoff seats than former NFL star Aaron Hernandez, and they made sure the whole world knew that they sat close to Jay-Z at a football game. Of course, like many young people who are blinded by money, they posted cliché photos showing off their bling while clutching giant wads of cash. Amanda even took the time out of her day to mention how seeing homeless people on her way to work reminded her just how blessed she was. We're not really sure blessed is the word for it, more like lucky she wasn't caught yet. But anyway, she received a long overdue reality check when she was let go from her job back in 2012 for falsifying her time card. An investigation was launched 6 months later after someone noticed a suspicious address change made on a victim's bank account. In just 4 days, the thieves had withdrawn over $25,000 from the account and bought front-row tickets at an NBA game. The activity was traced to Clyde Fortu's home in the Bronx. From there, investigators connected him to Amanda Ziminski, and they obtained a search warrant to eavesdrop on the couple's text conversations. Inside Amanda's BMW, they discovered over 20 stolen driver's licenses and over 50 fraudulent credit cards. Authorities quickly charged Amanda Ziminski, Clyde Fortu, and several others in connection to the theft ring. Clyde pleaded guilty to enterprise corruption and third-degree grand larceny as a hate crime and was sentenced to serve 3.5 to 10 years in prison. Amanda pleaded guilty to second-degree grand larceny and was given a 2 to 6 year prison sentence. Clyde's brother, Jerome Fortu, was handed a year in jail for his role in the massive scam, while a fourth conspirator, Abdel Youssef, pleaded guilty to a reduced charge and spent only 9 months in jail. Number 15. Levi Watson. It may not seem like that big of a legal risk to show off a stack of $100 bills or an expensive item on social media, but if you do that often enough, the authorities might swing by your home and demand an explanation as to how you can afford your lifestyle, especially if you have no job. 29-year-old Levi Watson of Wolverhampton, England, learned this lesson the hard way back in 2016 when he attracted the attention of police with his many Instagram posts featuring Lamborghinis, Rolexes, exotic vacations, helicopter rides, and a literal bathtub full of cash. One photo with the caption, "This is what 100K plus looks like," showed off off 3 Rolexes that dangled on the shift stick of a Porsche. On top of his absurd Instagram posts, Watson also made multiple rap videos which included at least one song about dealing drugs and swimming in money. Investigators eventually suspected that Watson was a drug dealer. When they questioned him, he claimed that he had no income and was simply living a quiet lifestyle, which they already knew wasn't true. 6 weeks after posting outrageous pictures, Watson was arrested along with 12 others in a large-scale bust targeting the drug ring he was supposedly in. He pleaded guilty to conspiracy to supply Class A drugs and was given 7 years in prison. In the United States, you can sometimes receive a reward for giving the IRS helpful information when it comes to suspected tax fraud. If you knew someone who was broke on paper but often seemed to have large amounts of cash on social media, would you consider sharing your suspicions with the authorities in hopes of getting a piece of the pie, or would you avoid snitching? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. Number 14. Jana T Webb. It's not completely strange for people to brag that they're good at driving drunk, even if it is stupid. Jana T Webb just so happened to be one of those people when she boasted in a tweet back in 2021 saying, "If you ask me, I'm the best drunk driver ever." The young woman's words quickly backfired on her in one of the worst possible ways 2 months later when she was accused of killing 2 Pennsylvania state troopers and an innocent civilian while being intoxicated behind the wheel. Troopers Martin Mack and Brandon Siska were helping 28-year-old Reyes Rivera Oliveras when Webb allegedly came in and slammed into them with her car. According to investigators, she hit the victims with such force that they flew across the street and straight into the opposite side of the highway. Mack, Siska, and Rivera Oliveras were immediately pronounced dead at the scene. At the time of her arrest, Webb had a blood alcohol level of 0.16, which is twice the legal limit for driving in Pennsylvania. She was charged with 13 crimes, including third-degree murder, DUI, homicide by vehicle while driving under the influence, second-degree manslaughter of a law enforcement officer, involuntary manslaughter, reckless endangerment, and many more. The case is set to go to trial in December 2023. Number 13. Gypsy Rose Blanchard and Nicholas Goatjohn. Gypsy Rose Blanchard was only a baby when her mom, Deah Blanchard, started telling everyone in their lives that their daughter had extreme health issues. And for as long as Gypsy could remember, she underwent one hellish medical treatment after another for the dozens of alleged ailments her mother claimed she suffered from. Gypsy could actually walk on her own, but Deah forced her to use a wheelchair to sell the sob story. She could also eat and digest food normally, but Deah convinced doctors Gypsy needed a feeding tube. Whenever hair started to grow on Gypsy's bald head, her mother quickly shaved it off while telling the world that it had fallen out from chemotherapy treatments. And when doctors tried giving Gypsy a chance to speak up for herself, Deah interrupted the conversation with claims that her daughter only had the mental capacity of a 7-year-old and didn't know what she was saying. In reality, almost nothing at all was medically wrong with Gypsy. Deah was actually the one who was sick. She suffered from a condition called Munchausen syndrome by proxy, which is when a caretaker, usually a parent, makes up fake symptoms or inflicts real symptoms to make it look like a person is sick. In Deah's case, she most likely did it for attention and the financial benefits that came with pretending to have a sick child. Deah took deliberate and meticulous measures to keep up the scam that Gypsy was chronically ill. She wouldn't let anyone get too close to her daughter, including the girl's father, but she was happy to take his child support payments as well as the disability and government assistance she received. In 2008, Habitat for Humanity built the mother-daughter duo a house in Springfield, Missouri, which was famously painted Gypsy's favorite color, pink. They also were given a free trip to Disney World thanks to the Make-A-Wish Foundation. Gypsy didn't even know how old she was, but after reaching a certain age, she finally understood that she wasn't really sick like her mom claimed. She could have easily proven that Deah was lying by getting up out of her wheelchair and walking in front of their neighbors. But Deah scared Gypsy into staying silent by beating her behind the scenes, handcuffing her to her bed, limiting her communication with the outside world, and planting doubt in her mind by insisting she wasn't mentally capable of speaking up for herself, and that nobody would believe her if she tried. By the time Gypsy secretly started chatting online with 23-year-old Nicholas Gojon in 2012, she was already in her 20s. But she was under the impression that she was still a teenager. She already tried to run away once by this point, and was punished severely for it. Gypsy's bond with Gojon grew as she opened up to him about the horrors of her home life and her deep desire to escape her mother's abuse. After realizing that Gypsy would never break free unless her mom was dead, the pair planned to kill Dee Dee. They put their plan into motion in 2015, 3 years after their online romance began. Gojon traveled from Waukesha, Wisconsin, to the Blanchard's home and stabbed Dee Dee to death as she slept in bed. Gypsy hid inside the bathroom until it was over, before the pair went to a nearby hotel. The next day, they fled to Gojon's home in Wisconsin. During their time on the run, Gypsy logged onto the joint Facebook account she shared with her mom and wrote, "That bitch is dead." She followed up the post with a comment stating that she slashed that fat pig and mentioning how Dee Dee's screams were so effing loud. LOL. Neighbors and acquaintances of the Blanchards quickly went to their home after seeing the troubling post and alerted authorities, who found Dee Dee's body. People remained worried for Gypsy's well-being since, as far as they knew, she couldn't walk and was completely defenseless by herself. But all it took for law enforcement to trace the crime back to Gypsy and Nick was a little bit of detective work. The two were arrested a few weeks after Dee Dee's death. Gypsy initially denied any involvement in the crime, but she eventually owned up to everything. She said that she made the Facebook posts because she wanted her mom's body to be found. Nick Gojon was given a life sentence for murder. Gypsy pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, but thanks to the unusual circumstances of her case and the suffering she endured at her mother's hands, she received sympathy from the court. The prosecution and judge felt that it was important to hold Gypsy accountable for her crime, since she could have sought help without killing Dee Dee, but they agreed to a more lenient 10-year prison sentence, which is extremely generous for a murder conviction. She could be paroled anytime now and plans to live in Louisiana with her dad and stepmother, who have supported her throughout the case. Number 12. Randy Washington. In September 2004, a man called into a Chicago-based radio talk show and bragged about robbing a TCF bank branch in South Chicago Heights just 5 months earlier. He claimed that he and 5 accomplices tied up employees, stole $81,000 cash, and spent some of their funds at expensive luxury stores. The caller even admitted to being the getaway driver in the heist and said that a former bank employee was also involved in the crime. A current bank employee just so happened to be listening into the program at the time, and they wasted no time calling law enforcement. An investigation was launched, and the FBI traced the call back to 24-year-old Randy Washington from Dalton, Illinois. After getting arrested, Washington initially denied any involvement in the bank robbery. He told detectives that he made the whole story up and that he made the call in hopes of winning a prize from the radio show. But the story he gave apparently made too much sense for investigators to simply write it off as a big coincidence. After realizing he wasn't going to convince anyone he was innocent, Washington agreed to cooperate with the investigation. Officers readily admitted that the robbery may have gone unsolved if Washington hadn't been so stupid and bragged about it on the radio. He pleaded guilty to federal charges and was sentenced to 14 months in prison. 2 of his associates, who he helped law enforcement catch after agreeing to help, also received 40-month sentences. Randy Washington's buddies probably weren't too happy with him when they got arrested thanks to his big mouth, but at the end of the day, they only had themselves to blame for participating in a crime they knew could land them in prison. Number 11. Marrick Heko. During summer 2022, 44-year-old father of 2, Adrian Ellingford, was lying in bed one day with his girlfriend in Essex, England, when the woman's ex-boyfriend, 26-year-old Marrick Heko, quietly snuck into their home and grabbed a knife from the kitchen. Heko then discreetly made his way into the bedroom, where he stabbed Ellingford with such force that he broke the handle right off the knife. According to police, Heko dated Ellingford's girlfriend in the past. When the woman ended the relationship, thanks to Heko's concerning drug habit, he became obsessive and refused to accept that they were over. He overwhelmed his ex with unwanted messages and showed up unannounced at her home and workplace multiple times, even though she made it abundantly clear that she wanted nothing to do with him. Heko also stalked the woman's social media in an effort to find out if she was dating someone new and who that person could be. On the day of Ellingford's murder, Heko purchased 2 bottles of wine. He drank one and left it at the scene, along with the knife handle, which luckily had his DNA on it. Truth be told, it probably wouldn't have been difficult for investigators to narrow him down as the prime suspect, considering his behavior leading up to the crime and the evidence discovered at the scene. But Heko made sure law enforcement's job was even easier when he went back to the crime scene a few hours after the murder with an open bottle of brandy in his hand and started bragging about how he knew what had happened, while periodically stopping to take large swigs of alcohol. In a disturbing body cam video clip of the incident, the boozed-up killer was heard saying, "I know what happened. I know the people involved. I know what happened, and you need me to figure out what happened. If you don't have me, you don't know what happened." Heko continued to slur his words as he dug himself into an even deeper hole, saying, "You're going to think about me, but it's not going to be me, because there's no proof." Not long after that, the footage showed Heko getting arrested and put in the back of a police van. He was found guilty of murdering Ellingford and was later sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 26 years before a chance at parole. Number 10. Kayla Ayers. After realizing that they had no legal reason to detain 19-year-old Kayla Ayers during a traffic stop in May 2018, police officers in Moses Lake, Washington, simply let the young woman go. They later got their hands on a warrant to search the vehicle in question and discovered a purse holding the young woman's ID and a handgun, which Ayers was not allowed to have because she was what police described as a prolific felon. By the time it was found, though, she had already gone into hiding. During her brief time on the run, Ayers apparently taunted the police department in a Facebook post, asking the public for help finding her. In a comment on one of the agency's posts, she reportedly bragged that she had gotten away. Using what they later described as covert investigative techniques, officers managed to trick Ayers into meeting them. She obviously thought they were someone else and had no clue she was going to be arrested. When she got there and realized she'd been tricked, she fled on foot. According to a Facebook update from the police department, Ayers made it only 4 steps before she was captured by officers and taken into custody. She was charged with unlawful possession of a firearm and possession of heroin. Number 9. Cody Allen Miller and Brandon Lee Blackwell. In December 2022, police officers in Elizabethton, Tennessee responded to a report that said a car driving up and down a residential street was constantly revving its engine in the middle of the night. Officers were on their way to the scene when they received a second call about shots being fired in the same area. They got there and discovered 2 vehicles had crashed. Inside one of the cars, the officers saw 31-year-old Philip Glass dead with multiple gunshot wounds. Anyone else involved in the crime had already fled the scene by that point, but a pistol registered to 23-year-old Cody Allen Miller was left behind inside one of the wrecked cars. After a short investigation, authorities charged Miller and an alleged accomplice, 34-year-old Brandon Lee Blackwell, with murder. According to an official affidavit, Glass was dating Miller's ex-girlfriend and tensions were high. Miller went to where Glass was staying to confront him and allegedly shot him with a .380 semi-automatic pistol. The affidavit also claims that Miller bragged to multiple people about how Glass was killed. He reportedly went into specifics about where he shot the victim and said how cool it was. Investigators connected the second suspect, Brandon Blackwell, to the crime after finding evidence that more than one handgun was used at the murder scene. He's accused of firing shots at the victim's windshield with a 9mm pistol. Blackwell also allegedly bragged afterward, telling people that he shot at Glass and that he believed he killed the victim. On top of the murder charge, Blackwell faces 1 count of harassment based on accusations that he sent multiple threatening voicemails to Glass's family members. Number 8. Ronald Heron. Better known by his stage name Ra Diggs, Ronald Heron was an up-and-coming rapper from Brooklyn who started posting his music on YouTube back in 2010, just a few months before he was accused of running the notorious, Bloods-affiliated, murderous Mad Dogs gang. According to federal prosecutors, Heron was in charge of both the cocaine and heroin trade across 2 large public housing complexes in the Borum Hill neighborhood. He was officially charged with 21 crimes in connection to his his gang activities, including racketeering, drug dealing, and 3 counts of murder. One of the murder charges was for the 2001 death of Frederick Brooks, which Heron had already tackled in state court after his accomplices intimidated 2 witnesses, making them refuse to testify. Prosecutors also accused Heron of congratulating his murderous associates in his YouTube videos. In one clip, he claimed to be the head of a murder team and was seen firing handguns. Heron also referenced the Brooks killing in a tweet, bragging about how he beat a body. In addition to the 2001 case, the feds charged him for the 2008 and 2009 murders of Richard Russo and Victor Zapata. Several clips from Heron's rap videos were used against him in court. Claims were made that the lyrics were retellings of his actual crimes. In the words of the prosecuting attorney, he styled himself as a rap artist, but is really just a drug dealer and a murderer who sought power through fear and intimidation. In 2014, a jury finally convicted Heron of all 21 counts. In April 2015, the judge overseeing the case handed him 3 life terms, plus 105 years. When Heron responded to the sentence by saying the judge could hand him 10 life sentences and he would still only die once, the judge clapped back, sentencing him to 12 life terms, plus 105 years. Despite the horrific nature of his crimes, Heron had a lot of supporters throughout his case. They showed their loyalty by walking out of the courtroom during the victim's impact statements and shouting at the judge when he questioned whether Heron deserved to be assigned to a prison where his children could still visit him. At one point, tensions got so heated that court officers escorted Heron's advocates out of the courtroom. Heron later decided to appeal his conviction, claiming that it violated his First Amendment rights, but the ruling was ultimately upheld. He remains behind bars at a high-security prison in Florence, Colorado, where he's in the company of some of the country's most famous, like-minded criminals. Number 7. Ariel Maya. During the morning of December 1st, 2021, an armed intruder snuck into the Beverly Hills home of legendary music producer Clarence Avant and shot his 81-year-old wife, Jacqueline. As the killer left the property, he fired multiple rounds at an unarmed security guard who managed to avoid getting hit by the random bullets. Investigators were unsure of the intruder's motive at first, and they hesitated to speculate on whether the couple was targeted specifically or not. As the news spread, many wondered who would want to kill Jacqueline, a well-known philanthropist who dedicated much of her time, money, and energy toward bettering the community. About an hour after the shooting, the primary suspect, Ariel Maya, was taken into custody during a burglary in progress at another home. He had accidentally shot himself in the foot and called 911 for help. Maya was on parole at the time of Jacqueline Avant's murder. He was released from prison just 3 months earlier for a second robbery with great bodily harm conviction. After being arrested, he bragged in a phone call made from jail to a friend about how he would only have to serve 20 to 25 years in prison for the crime. At the time, LA's infamously easy-on-crime district attorney George Gascon had not filed for special circumstances in the case, which allows the possibility of life without parole or the death sentence. For most people, the thought of spending 20 or more years behind bars feels pretty much like a life sentence, perhaps only slightly less awful. But Maya was apparently excited over the thought of seeing freedom again in his 50s. During another phone call placed to a female friend, he laughed at all the publicity surrounding the case. The woman Maya was speaking with said, "That's not funny, that's somebody's life." But the alleged killer went on with his mockery, asking his friend if she thought his mom had seen him on the news yet. He also incriminated himself further by mentioning that he thought he was going to get $50,000 from the botched robbery at the Avant household. Maya kept openly discussing his crimes, telling one friend after another what he did. In addition to his self-incriminating phone calls, he left behind a glove at the Avant house and was captured on surveillance video at both crime scenes. Maya was probably shocked that District Attorney Gascon had no plans to go easy on him. In fact, he was seeking a 3-strike enhancement based on Maya's criminal history, which carried a punishment of 150 years to life. While many, if not most prisoners were eligible for parole at some point under California law, Gascon said that his goal was to secure a de facto sentence that would make sure Mena spent the rest of his life behind bars. A 3 strikes conviction would easily disqualify Mena from any type of early release. The defendant pleaded guilty to Jacqueline Avant's murder, as well as attempted murder, residential burglary, and a gun charge. He begged the judge for leniency, specifically noting that he had grown up in the foster care system. But the court was unsympathetic, and Mena was ultimately sentenced to 190 years in prison. Number 6. Marvin Spencer Sr., Marvin Spencer Jr., and Derek Lynch. In July 2014, 2 thieves robbed a pawn shop in Roseville, Minnesota, and made off with almost $60,000 worth of precious gems. Nobody was killed during the robbery, but an employee was shot in the leg. The suspects, later identified as 51-year-old Marvin Spencer Sr. and his son, 24-year-old Derek Spencer Jr., left the area immediately afterward. About a week later, someone overheard the pair arguing and bragging about the crime at a hotel outside Atlanta and noticed they had a large amount of jewelry and cash on them. The observant witness Googled the crime and quickly recognized the men in the surveillance footage as the 2 they saw and heard earlier that day. In the video, Spencer Sr. was seen firing a gun multiple times while another man smashed the display case and grabbed as many valuables as he possibly could. By the time law enforcement was notified of the sighting, the older Spencer had left the hotel thanks to the argument with his son. Spencer Jr. was apprehended. In his phone, investigators discovered pictures of him wearing some of the stolen jewelry from the pawn shop. Authorities tracked Spencer to a house in Moline, Illinois, and took him into federal custody on suspicion of aggravated robbery, possession of a firearm, assault, and attempted murder. During questioning, he allegedly claimed that he didn't realize the gun he used in the robbery was still loaded until he pulled the trigger. In an unexpected twist, the man seen with Spencer Sr. in the surveillance footage was later identified as 51-year-old Derek Lynch. According to the Roseville police, Spencer Jr. was not actually directly involved in the robbery, but still bragged about it at the hotel in Georgia. He was released from custody, and Lynch was later charged with 3 counts of aggravated first-degree robbery. Number 5. Dale Scott Harris. Back in the mid-90s, gossip didn't spread nearly as fast as it does today, thanks to the wonders of the internet and social media. But word still traveled quickly, especially in small cities like Trinity, North Carolina, which was home to only 7,000 or so people at the time. 35-year-old Dale Scott Harris learned this lesson in 1994 when he was accused of killing a man and bragging about it. According to law enforcement, Michael Wade Beeson was accused of abusing a member of Harris's family. In a rare but not unheard of act of revenge, Harris went to Beeson's home and shot him dead in his front yard. On the way back to his house, Harris stopped at a video store in Thomasville and rented a few John Wayne movies. According to the clerk, he casually mentioned that he just killed someone. He also bragged to several other people about the crime, including his own brother. Naturally, someone contacted the police, and deputies quickly surrounded Harris's residence. When the suspect took a break from his movie marathon to use a neighbor's phone, they were already waiting to arrest him. He was taken into custody without incident and charged with Beeson's murder. In his VCR, deputies discovered the 1970 western Rio Lobo, which is about a conflict between John Wayne and a corrupt sheriff. During questioning, Harris admitted to the crime and even got a little teary-eyed. Investigators concluded that he decided to take the law into his own hands after Beeson was charged in connection to the abuse case involving a member of Harris's family. Ironically, Harris was facing similar charges in an unrelated incident that happened just a few months before he killed Beeson. During his trial for first-degree murder, Harris argued that he never actually meant to kill Beeson and that he committed the act in the heat of passion. The jury agreed and found him guilty of the lesser charge of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to a measly 11 years in prison. Harris's now estranged wife, Crystal Cyrus Harris, and another suspect, Donnie Edward Graves, pleaded no contest to being accessories to murder and were sentenced to 3 years of probation. The video store clerk who crossed paths with Dale Harris not long after Michael Beeson's murder had quite the interesting day at work, to say the least. For those of you who have had the pleasure of working in retail or customer service, what's the scariest situation you had with someone at your job? Tell us about it in the comments below, but be sure to subscribe first. Number 4. Christopher Paul Maya. 32-year-old Michelle Angela Morales Nakaza was reported missing in March 2023 by her mom. A week or so later, a tipster contacted police and said they knew someone with information about Michelle's death. They sent investigators to a friend who revealed that Michelle had a toxic history with a 34-year-old man named Christopher Paul Maya. The friend explained that Maya told him he was going to kill Michelle multiple times. A few nights before, Maya asked a friend to help him remove some surveillance cameras at a private property. Sensing that Maya was up to no good, they refused to help. When the friend saw Michelle's missing person flyer a few days later, he grew even more suspicious of Maya. The icing on the cake came when Maya confessed to killing Michelle during a conversation with the informant. According to the source, Maya said that he and Michelle were sleeping in a car when he suddenly woke up and noticed that his wallet was missing. He then allegedly bragged about how he shot Michelle twice in the chest based on the assumption that she stole his wallet. After she slumped forward, Maya shot her again in the face. The informant claimed that Maya was noticeably excited when he talked about how the final shot blew off some of the victim's face. Both the original tipster and the person they told law enforcement to speak to gave similar accounts of Maya's crime. Using additional information provided by the informants, police found Michelle's body in the desert not long after. U.S. Marshals arrested Maya at a Walmart and took him to the El Paso County Jail, where he remains behind bars to this day on suspicion of murder. Number 3. Benjamin Robinson and Daniel Hutchinson. In a boneheaded crime spree that made international headlines back in 2014, a pair of thieves dubbed the Fruit Machine Bandits traveled across the UK and stole thousands of pounds from gambling machines. The suspects, 30-year-old Benjamin Robinson and 24-year-old Daniel Hutchinson, wore balaclavas during the robberies but made a habit of taking pictures of themselves while committing the crimes. In the photos, the men seemed childishly wide-eyed and giddy, as if they were incredibly entertained by their illegal activities. Police officers arrested the suspects during a routine traffic stop for speeding in North Yorkshire. By then, Robinson and Hutchinson were at the center of a multi-agency investigation into their crimes. Inside the men's car, investigators found over $1,001 coins, $2,000 in paper money, and a screwdriver the dim-witted duo used for breaking into machines. Both suspects ultimately pleaded guilty to conspiracy to steal. Robinson was sentenced to spend 32 months in prison, while Hutchinson received a 6-month sentence, suspended for 2 years. Under the terms set forth by the judge, this meant Hutchinson would not serve any time behind bars, as long as he fulfilled all of the court's requirements, which included performing 120 hours of unpaid work and following certain rules for 2 years. After being convicted of the robberies, Robinson told news reporters outside the courthouse that he didn't care if he was guilty. In his words, he said, "I'm not bothered, mate. I love it, mate." In a statement, Detective Chief Inspector Matt Walker gave the thieves credit for taking selfies, since it was the thing that caused their ultimate downfall, along with their greed and arrogance. Number 2. Brian Costa. People rarely get away with murder, but Brian Costa may have been among the lucky few, if only he hadn't bragged about taking James J. Collister's life. After beating the victim to death with a baseball bat in Pinellas Park, Florida back in 1996, Costa reportedly started bragging to family and friends about whacking Collister. Multiple people called the police, including Costa's brother and a few of his co-workers. By then, Costa had already fallen under police officers' radar. They discovered that Collister was on his way to the suspect's house when he was killed, leading them to think that Costa was responsible for the crime and that it was drug-related. Collister was also having an affair with Costa's wife, which is more than enough cause for motive in the eyes of the court. After learning that law enforcement was onto him, Costa fled to California. While he was on the run, investigators re-interviewed his wife, who acted as an ally to the killer in the immediate aftermath of Collister's murder. She admitted that she was unsure of her husband's whereabouts during the day of the crime. At a time when DNA technology was in its infancy, there was an absence of any compelling physical evidence linking Costa to the crime. Prosecutors admitted that his bragging played a major part in sealing the case. Costa pleaded guilty to a reduced second-degree murder charge thanks to the lack of physical evidence and was sentenced to just 15 years in prison. And now for number 1. But if you want to hear even more stories, stay tuned for some extra content that you might have missed. Number 1. Cameron Chanao Kim. In November 2019, while responding to a phone call about shots fired and a single-vehicle car accident late one night, police officers in Beaufort, South Carolina, found a blue Ford Mustang crashed into a tree with bullet holes in its rear window. Nearby, they discovered the car's owner, 20-year-old Ethan Bosworth, unresponsive, with multiple gunshot wounds. He was declared dead thanks to his injuries later that night. Inside Bosworth's car, investigators located his unlocked cell phone. It contained a Snapchat message from someone named Cam, along with several calls with the person, including one from just a few minutes before the first 911 call about the shooting came in. Authorities traced the contents and other evidence from the phone to 20-year-old Cameron Chanao Kim of Ladies Island and charged him with Bosworth's murder. During Kim's trial, prosecutor Mary Smith accused the defendant of being motivated by jealousy. In the days leading up to the shooting, Kim allegedly became convinced that his girlfriend was cheating on him with Bosworth. He also recently purchased a gun and, in the prosecution's words, was anxious to prove his street cred. Smith even went as far as describing Kim's desire to look tough as a sick fantasy that he needed to fulfill. After a day of drinking and smoking weed, Kim challenged Bosworth to meet up. He set out on foot and shot the victim as soon as his vehicle pulled up. Kim later bragged to his friends about the crime. He was convicted of the charge and received a 45-year prison sentence for murder. His projected release date is in 2064, at which point he'll be well into his 60s. Number 12. Nikki Secondino. All hell broke loose at an apartment building in Brooklyn's Bensonhurst neighborhood early one morning in 2023. A resident overheard her neighbor, 61-year-old Carlo Secondino, screaming for help. Carlo's daughter, 22-year-old Nikki Secondino, banged on the woman's door and demanded help. The neighbor opened her door to find a hallway spattered with blood. Not wanting to get involved for obvious reasons, she immediately went back into her apartment and dialed 911. Responding officers found Carlo dead and his 19-year-old daughter, Liana, clinging to life. Lana was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. Meanwhile, Nikki claimed that a pair of burglars had broken in and attacked her father and sister. The NYPD launched a manhunt, only to call it off hours later after they began to strongly suspect that Nikki was lying. There were no signs of forced entry into the apartment, and a window had been broken from inside. A neighbor told the New York Daily News that Nikki and Carlo had a volatile relationship and could often be heard fighting. Several other people made similar statements, including a co-worker of Carlo's and a local exterminator who said that the fights between the father and daughter sometimes became physical. Despite these issues, people who knew the family said that Carlo tried to do what was best for his daughter, who is transgender. And although he espoused some markedly right-wing views on social media, he supported and paid for Nikki's transition. After Carlo's murder, police noticed cuts on Nikki that were consistent with a knife slipping in someone's hand during a stabbing. During questioning, she allegedly confessed to murdering her family in cold blood, after being told that she had 30 days to move out and learning that they planned to pursue a restraining order against her. Authorities charged Nikki with murder, attempted murder, and criminal possession of a weapon. She's currently being held at Rikers without bail and could face life in prison if convicted. Number 11. Joanna Dennehy. 48-year-old property developer Kevin Lee was found dead in a ditch outside Peterborough, England in March 2013. He had been stabbed multiple times and dressed in a black sequin dress, as if to emasculate him even in death. A few days later, the similarly murdered remains of 31-year-old Polish national Lukasz Labaszewski and 56-year-old John Chapman were found near the village of Thorney. All three men had one woman in common. Joanna Dennehy. Kevin Lee was Dennehy's landlord and lover. Lucas Labashevsky had recently met her at a bar and drank with her, and John Chapman was her roommate. Police traced the murders to Dennehy after finding Lee's body. They soon learned that she had carried out her crimes with the help from an accomplice who was identified as 47-year-old Gary Stretch. Dennehy killed the three men over a 10-day span. After claiming her third victim, she stabbed two male dog walkers at random. One of the last two victims, John Rogers, was stabbed over 40 times. He and the other dog walker survived, and Dennehy fell short of her stated goal of killing 9 men in order to be like Bonnie and Clyde. Gary Stretch and another alleged accomplice, 36-year-old Leslie Layton, claimed that they only went along with the crimes out of fear. A look into Dennehy's past revealed a troubling pattern of addiction, crime, and profound mental illness. While being booked into custody, she joked around and laughed like it was any other day, and even flirted with a male officer. Dennehy told police that she targeted men specifically and avoided killing women, especially women with kids. She admitted to killing the victims for entertainment and said that the first 3 murders left her with a craving to continue killing. After discovering her plan to escape custody by cutting off a guard's finger and using his fingerprint to get through the security system, jail staff put Dennehy in solitary confinement, where she remained for 2 years leading up to her trial. She ultimately pleaded guilty to all 3 murders and was sentenced to life in prison. In a relatively rare move in Britain's criminal justice system, the judge imposed a whole life order, which means that Dennehy will remain behind bars until her dying day. Number 10. Dustin Lee Honkin and Angela Johnson. In 1992, Dustin Lee Honkin became one of the biggest methamphetamine producers in the United States. He set up shop in Arizona and routinely trafficked the drug to 2 dealers in his hometown of Mason City, Iowa. Within a year of starting the operation, Honkin and his best friend, Tim Cutcomb, were nabbed on federal drug trafficking charges. Like almost any other major drug case, prosecutors were relying on testimony from one of Honkin's dealers, Greg Nicholson, to secure a conviction. Authorities had previously arrested Nicholson after finding a large amount of meth in his house. He agreed to turn into the state's witness and help gather evidence against Honkin in exchange for leniency. After finding out that Nicholson had worn a wire during a conversation about a drug deal, Honkin was livid. And just like that, Nicholson, his girlfriend, Lori Ann Duncan, and Lori's 2 kids vanished. Without Nicholson's testimony, the government's case against Honkin was severely weakened. But the feds weren't going to back down without a fight. They soon began to target Honkin's other main dealer, Terry DeGuse, who also conveniently disappeared before he could testify against Honkin. Without any more witnesses to help with the case, the government was left with no choice but to drop the charges. Honkin and Cutcomb went back to manufacturing and selling meth, but were busted again in the fall of 1995. This time, Cutcomb cooperated with authorities and gathered evidence of Honkin admitting to murdering the 5 missing witnesses. And he was planning to kill several more people in connection with the new drug case. In one chilling recording, Cutcomb asked Honkin if the fact that he was a killer bothered him. He said no, that he didn't even think about it. Honkin pleaded guilty to the drug charges and was sentenced to 27 years in prison. The judge declined to rule on whether he was involved in the witness disappearances. A breakthrough in the case finally came in 2000 after a jailhouse informant convinced Honkin to draw maps of where he buried the missing bodies. Around the same time, Christy Gorbatz, a former friend of Honkin's girlfriend Angela Johnson, went to the police to share what she knew. She was too scared to speak up before, but her conscience could no longer allow her to remain quiet. Investigators learned that Angela Johnson went to Nicholson's house pretending to be a saleswoman. Honkin barged in from behind her, and they forced the first 4 victims into a car at gunpoint. The couple drove the family out to a secluded area and executed them in cold blood. 5 months later, Johnson lured Terry DeGuse to a country club, then drove him to an abandoned house where Honkin beat and shot him. 7 years later, the remains of all 5 victims were recovered, and Honken and Johnson were federally charged with multiple counts of murder. They were both found guilty and sentenced to death. Honken was executed by lethal injection in 2020 after exhausting all his appeals, while Johnson's sentence was eventually commuted to life without parole. Number 9. Laura Rideout. Devoted father of 7, Craig Rideout would have never abandoned his children. His loved ones immediately suspected foul play when the 50-year-old computer programmer vanished from his home near Rochester, New York in 2016. Craig's sister, Robin Drew, began to fear the worst when she found blood spatter inside Craig's house, and she was also suspicious to find his ex-wife, Laura, at the home cleaning. The family's fears were soon confirmed, with the discovery of Craig's badly disfigured body in a wooded area about 50 miles, 80.5 kilometers away. He was wrapped in a tarp, and his face and hands had been burned with acid. An autopsy would later rule that Craig was strangled to death. In the 2 years leading up to his murder, Craig had gone through a bitter custody battle with Laura, who had an affair and moved in with his best friend, Paul Tucci. The former couple's older children were allowed to choose which parent they wanted to live with, while Craig won custody of the 2 youngest. This became a problem for Laura when she and Tucci made plans to move to North Carolina and failed to get Craig's or the court's permission to take the 2 youngest kids with them. So it's no surprise that both police and Craig's family immediately suspected Laura and Paul of being involved. Their suspicions heightened when cops ran into Craig's 2 adult sons, Colin and Alexander, while they were disposing of some garbage bags at a local pond called the Devil's Bathtub. Inside the bags, police found empty bottles of cleaner, gloves, bloody clothing, and some other items. Forensic analysis connected the evidence to the brothers, as well as Laura and Paul. Law enforcement recovered surveillance footage of Paul Tucci's car and Craig's van heading in the direction of the crime scene. They also found videos of Laura and Paul buying a large amount of cleaning supplies, which the couple claimed they used to clean their house before moving. Authorities charged Paul, Laura, Colin, and Alexander with murder and various other charges surrounding Craig's death. During the trial, prosecutors described how Laura had allegedly turned several of the children against Craig. Just days before Craig's murder, after he refused to allow Laura to take the younger children to North Carolina, Colin had emailed his father, accusing him of being manipulative and abusive. A few months earlier, Colin and Laura had exchanged text messages with plans to have 2 of the other kids stage an incident in an effort to get Craig's custody taken away. Their plan involved provoking Craig's temper and capturing evidence of his reaction to prove that he was an unfit parent. And these attempts clearly did not work because Craig still had custody of the kids when he was killed, making it easy for prosecutors to establish a motive in court. All 4 defendants were tried together, and each defendant's attorney pointed the finger at their co-defendants during the trial, causing the family's initially united front to collapse. The jury acquitted Paul Tucci of the charges, found Alexander Rideout guilty of tampering with evidence, and convicted Laura and Colin Rideout of second-degree murder. Laura and Colin were sentenced to 26 years to life in prison. Alexander received a 2 to 8-year sentence, which he has finished serving, and Tucci walked free. Number 8. Stephen Michael Cook Jr. Stephen Michael Cook Jr. arrived home one evening in April 2000 and found his girlfriend, 24-year-old Heidi Bernard-Zykowski, dead and bleeding on the floor of their Dundalk, Maryland townhouse. When police arrived, they found him in hysterics as he cradled Heidi's lifeless body in his arms. She had been strangled and cut across the throat. Detectives noticed that the home looked ransacked, yet there were plenty of valuables that hadn't been taken, leading them to suspect that the scene was staged to look like a robbery gone wrong. On the wall in pink lipstick, the killer had written "Number 1, and investigators weren't sure if it had a hidden meaning or if it was put there in an attempt to mislead them. During questioning, Cook adamantly denied any involvement in Heidi's murder. He said he picked her up from her job at 5 o'clock in the evening and took her home because she had to use the bathroom. He didn't want to wait for her, so he left again on his own to run some errands. Cook insisted that his relationship with Heidi was going well and provided documentation to prove his alibi. But investigators were troubled when they learned that the couple had hefty life insurance policies, despite having very average jobs. Cook worked part-time at a Lowe's home improvement store and Heidi was a secretary, yet their policies were for $900,000 and $700,000. Police also learned that the relationship between Stephen and Heidi wasn't as picture-perfect as he made it sound. In fact, while they once had plans to marry, things had become rocky and Heidi had been thinking about leaving Stephen. But without enough evidence to implicate Cook, the cops had no choice but to let him go for the time being and focus their efforts elsewhere. Shortly before the murder, Heidi had answered the door to a stranger who said he wanted to start a neighborhood watch program. She didn't recognize him, and she got bad vibes, so she ended the conversation quickly. After going back inside, she made a drawing of a distinctive tattoo she had noticed on the man's forearm, just in case, God forbid, the need to identify him ever arose. All leads ran dry, and the case went cold. 11 years later, DNA technology had come a long way, and detectives decided to run the crime scene evidence to see if they could get a hit. To their complete shock, they obtained a profile that matched to a man in Colorado named Alexander Bennett, who also had a tattoo matching the drawing Heidi had made years earlier of the creepy neighborhood watch guy. Police flew to Colorado and interviewed Bennett, who said he ended up living on the streets in Maryland after his friends abandoned him on their way to a concert. When confronted with the DNA evidence, which came from beneath Heidi's fingernails, Bennett claimed he was attacked by a crazy woman at a bus stop. But one of his friends told investigators that Lewis had admitted to stabbing someone, and he was arrested on suspicion of murder. Bennett finally decided to talk at the 11th hour, right before his trial was about to start. He admitted to killing Heidi and implicated his friend and the prosecution's star witness, Grant Lewis, claiming that the men traveled to Baltimore after being hired as hitmen by Cook. The men had advertised their services online in hopes of raising enough money to open their own nightclub. Cook never paid the $60,000 he had promised to Lewis and Bennett for the hit, and he only received 20% of Heidi's life insurance payout after being sued by her family. In exchange for his cooperation, Bennett was convicted of murder and sentenced to 30 years. Lewis and Cook were both found guilty and sentenced to life without parole. Cook unsuccessfully appealed his conviction and continues to maintain his innocence as he pursues another appeal through the Supreme Court. Number 7. Amy Pressmeyer and Billy Hoffman. When 21-year-old Ricky Cowles began dating Amy Pressmeyer in 1997, his parents disapproved because of their age gap and banned Amy from coming over to their property. So Ricky rented his own place in Lancaster, California, and it wasn't long before Amy moved in. She soon began to move her friends in, and the condo became known as a party house, which Ricky wasn't too crazy about. By the time Amy discovered that she was pregnant, sparks between the couple had started to fizzle. Amy's friends were still staying at the condo, even though Ricky wanted them gone, and he disapproved of their drug use. He began to think maybe Amy wasn't the one for him after all. But he felt a responsibility toward his unborn child, and he believed that making his relationship with Amy work was a part of fulfilling his fatherly duties. Ricky and Amy vowed to work on things and made plans to have some time alone together one August evening. Despite these plans, Amy went to the fair with some friends, then returned home with her friend Sarah Chapin. The young women went upstairs to find Ricky bludgeoned and shot in the head. He was clinging to life, but was unable to tell paramedics who attacked him. Emergency responders airlifted him to the hospital, where he underwent emergency surgery but succumbed to his injuries. Ricky's family found Amy's behavior odd. In a 2023 Dateline interview, his mother recalled hearing her son's pregnant girlfriend say her final goodbyes to Ricky and expressing her disappointment about how he had promised to buy her a car for her birthday. But the case languished for months without any suspects being identified. Authorities caught their first big break when a young man who had gotten arrested and was hoping for leniency tipped them off to a suspect named Billy Hoffman. Within days of the murder, Hoffman had bragged to multiple people about being the shooter, yet nobody had come forward. He was arrested in April 1998, roughly 7 months after the crime, and denied any involvement in the crime, but was convicted of murder. Hoffman was sentenced to life without parole, and while this marked a major step toward justice for Ricky, his family didn't believe Billy committed the murder on his own. He had no reason to. Billy and Ricky didn't even know each other, despite having mutual friends, yet he hadn't implicated anyone else in the crime. Suspecting that he killed Ricky for someone and protected that person's identity, Ricky's loved ones spent years hoping for the next big break in the case. It finally came in 2002, when they received a letter from Billy Hoffman containing a full confession. He wrote that he had killed Ricky at the urging of Amy Pressmeyer and her friend, Jennifer Kellogg. In a tearful interview with Dateline reporter Keith Morrison, Hoffman admitted that he agreed to commit the shooting because he wanted to be cool and emulate the gangster rap he was listening to at the time. In the years since, he came to deeply regret his actions and their impact on the victims' loved ones. Ricky's family turned the letter over to law enforcement, and after 3 more years of investigating and turning up new information, authorities charged Amy and Jennifer in connection with the murder. The 2 women were put in a jail cell together, unaware that it was wired and recording their conversations. Jennifer refused to say much, but Amy was captured whispering about the idea of killing Billy Hoffman, so he couldn't testify against them as the prosecution's star witness. But that never happened, and in 2007 the decade-old case finally went to trial. Amy maintained her innocence, arguing that she had no motive for killing Ricky. But the jury found her guilty and she was sentenced to life without parole. Jennifer Kellogg took a deal and pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter and solicitation of murder. She was sentenced to 17 years in prison. In a shocking twist, Billy Hoffman was released on parole in 2020 due to a new state law granting new consideration to youthful offenders. Amy also applied to benefit under the new law, but for now she remains behind bars with an earliest possible parole date of 2029. Number 6. Mario Fernandez Saldana. While driving down a wooded road in Jacksonville Beach, Florida in February 2022, 33-year-old Microsoft executive and father of 4, Jared Bridegan, spotted a tire in the middle of the road. When he got out to move it, someone gunned him down in a fatal ambush he never saw coming. His daughter was in the car when it happened. Suspicion immediately turned to Bridegan's ex-wife, Jana Gardner Fernandez. Although the former couple had been divorced for 7 years, their battles over money and custody of the 2 children they shared were never-ending. Jana denied any involvement in her ex-husband's murder, but remained on law enforcement's radar as they chased down leads in search of the truth. In January 2023, authorities announced the arrest of 61-year-old Henry Tenen, who was a tenant of Shana's current husband, 34-year-old Mario Fernandez Saldana. According to prosecutors, Tenen pulled the trigger in the shooting. He took a deal and pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for his cooperation against his co-conspirators. He faces 15 years to life in prison. 2 months later, in March 2023, Mario was charged with first-degree murder with a weapon, conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, solicitation to commit a capital felony, and child abuse. He's accused of hiring Tenen to shoot Bridegan. According to court documents, the suspects planned the killing more than a month in advance. Bank and phone records reportedly revealed that Fernandez Saldana wrote several checks to Tenen and that the 2 exchanged dozens of phone calls in the weeks leading up to the murder. Prosecutors have made it clear that they intend to seek the death penalty against Fernandez Saldana, an announcement that came on the heels of a new state law that only requires 8 out of 12 jurors to vote in favor of death in order to impose the sentence. For many, questions linger about Jana Gardner Fernandez's possible involvement in the crime. Her attorney declined to comment, and the investigation is ongoing. In the meantime, sources told News4Jax that she has moved to Washington State to be near her family. Number 5. Colin Dudley. Colin Dudley had a live-in girlfriend and didn't want children, but he reconnected with his ex-girlfriend, Cassandra Cantrell. Things happened between them, and 33-year-old Cassandra became pregnant in 2020. She was excited to be a mom, and she was under the impression that Colin planned to take responsibility for his role as the father. In reality, he was desperately looking to escape it in any way possible. Cassandra had a best friend and was close with her mother, yet neither of them had any idea where she was when she disappeared the day before her first ultrasound. She was last seen driving away from her mother's house near Tacoma, Washington. Her social media activity also stopped that day, which was highly out of character. Authorities found her car abandoned with the keys inside near downtown Tacoma, but there was no sign of Cassandra herself. Law enforcement worked around the clock in an effort to find the mother-to-be, and the FBI joined the search within days of Cassandra's disappearance. They quickly narrowed their sights on Colin Dudley, who denied any knowledge of his ex-girlfriend's whereabouts or involvement in the case. In fact, Colin claimed he hadn't spoken to Cassandra in years, but investigators knew that was a lie. Phone records proved that Cassandra was at Colin's home on the morning of her disappearance. From there, it was traced to Puget Sound before becoming untraceable. By some miracle, or perhaps some really good detective work, they managed to retrieve the phone from the water. About a month after Cassandra vanished, GPS data from Colin's truck led police to a nearby town, where they found the missing woman's body wrapped in garbage bags in a ravine. She had been bludgeoned and stabbed to death. Surveillance footage from the day of the murder showed Colin buying garbage bags at a Costco store, and they also uncovered video of him walking through a light rail station very close to where Cassandra's car was found. He was wearing a fedora and blue latex gloves in the video. Investigators traced his movements to a nearby parking garage, where he was seen getting into his truck and driving away. Unswayed by Dudley's claims of innocence and his girlfriend's backing, authorities charged him with first-degree murder. He took a deal and pleaded guilty in exchange for a 26-year prison sentence. Number 4. Sheila Keene Warren. In a disturbing case that haunted detectives for nearly 30 years, Marlena Warren answered the front door of her Wellington, Florida home one morning in 1990 to find a clown standing there with carnations and balloons. The clown handed the items to Warren, who responded, "Oh, how nice," as the clown pulled a gun and shot her in the face, killing her right in front of her son and his friends. Investigators were baffled by the bizarre case, which left a historically safe community shaken and looking over their shoulder. At the time, Marlena's husband, Michael, was having an affair with a woman named Sheila Keene Warren, who he eventually married. The couple were questioned, and detectives learned that Sheila had recently worn a clown costume for a promotional gig at an auto parts store. But there wasn't enough evidence to charge her, and the case went cold. The sheriff's cold case squad finally reopened it in 2014. Between fresh detective work and advances in DNA technology, they finally came up with enough evidence to charge Sheila with Marlena's murder. Among the new discoveries was a piece of Sheila's hair that was found in the getaway car. She was arrested in 2017 in North Carolina, where she and Michael Warren had been living since tying the knot in 2002. Sheila initially faced a first-degree murder charge, which carries a punishment of either life in prison or death in the state of Florida. She insisted she was innocent, but pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in 2023 as part of a generous plea offer that may see her released from prison in as little as 16 months. The deal comes with a sentence of 12 years, with credit for the 5.5 years Sheila spent in county jail while the case was pending. Because the murder happened over 30 years ago, her sentence will be subject to the laws that were in place at the time, which had generous gain time incentives. Sentencing laws are stricter today, but they do not apply to Sheila's case. Number 3. Richie Wilder Jr. and Cynthia Wilder. 30-year-old mother of 3, Angela Wilder, had a promising future to look forward to after divorcing the father of her first 2 children. She was pursuing her nursing degree at Minot University in North Dakota, was in a happy relationship with her fiancé, Chris Jackson, and had recently learned that she was expecting her 4th child. But Angela's life plans were interrupted in 2015 when someone entered her house and stabbed her 40 times while Chris was at work. Chris arrived home in the morning after working 3rd shift to find the back door kicked in and immediately dialed 911. During the call, he said that he was about to go inside, but the operator told him not to. Chris obeyed the instruction and would soon come under scrutiny by law enforcement for not entering the home anyway. Police struggled to reconcile the idea of a man who was worried about his family obediently waiting outside the home for officers to arrive. It made them wonder if Chris was somehow involved in his fiancé's murder. But he insisted he wasn't and told investigators that Angela had been nervous about staying home alone when he left for work the night before. She thought she had heard someone tampering with the front door the previous evening and had recently felt like she was being watched. After confirming Chris's alibi, detectives moved on to the next name that popped up on their list, Angela's ex-husband, Richie Wilder Jr. They had overheard Chris mentioning Richie during a phone call he made in the interrogation room, and would soon discover that Angela and Richie were entangled in a vicious custody dispute over their 2 children at the time of the murder. What's more, Richie had been kicked out of the military for domestic violence during their marriage. Angela's sister later told Dateline that Angela had called her in a panic one day after waking up and finding Richie in her living room. He allegedly said, "See, I told you I can get to you if I wanted to." Richie denied any involvement in the murder and claimed he was home all night. His wife Cynthia backed up his story, but it was considered a shaky alibi since she might be willing to lie for her husband. After finding a spot of Angela's blood in Richie's car, authorities charged him with murder. He refused to speak about the crime until shortly before his trial was scheduled, when he claimed that he and Chris had planned to confront Angela together because she had cheated on them both. Richie said that Chris took things too far and murdered Angela in a cold-hearted rage as he looked on helplessly. But Chris's workplace was filled with surveillance cameras, and the footage proved that he didn't leave his job that night. After deliberating for less than an hour, the jury convicted Richie of murder, and he was sentenced to life without parole. Months later, Cynthia's friend came forward to police with information they had suspected all along: that Cynthia not only knew about the murder, but was involved in masterminding it. The friend wore a wire which captured audio of Cynthia talking at length about how she and Richie had planned the murder for around 2 years. She kept tabs on Angela in the time leading up to the killing, which could perhaps explain why the victim felt she was being watched. Cynthia said with confidence to her friend that she believed the murder was necessary. She was arrested for conspiracy to commit murder and turned down a 25-year plea offer. Instead, she entered an Alford plea, which meant that she maintained her innocence but acknowledged that the prosecution likely had a strong enough case to secure a conviction. In a move that shocked everyone involved in the case, including the prosecution, the judge sentenced Cynthia to the maximum sentence of life in prison without parole. Number 2. Nicholas Firkus. During the early morning hours of April 25, 2010, 911 dispatchers in St. Paul, Minnesota received a phone call from Nicholas Firkus. He was in a hysterical state as he explained that a home intruder had shot his wife Heidi while she was trying to escape out the back door of their home. Officers arrived minutes later to find Heidi unresponsive and bleeding on the kitchen floor. She had been shot in the head and was pronounced dead at the scene. Nick had a gunshot wound to his leg and survived. During questioning, Nick Firkus claimed that 1 or 2 intruders broke into the house. At the time, he wasn't sure what they looked like, but he would later describe one of them as a tall black man. Nick said he grabbed his gun and he and Heidi made a run for it, but the burglar managed to wrestle the gun away from him and shot Heidi. Investigators' ears perked up when they learned that the couple was about to lose their home to foreclosure. In fact, they were supposed to move out the very next day. It would later be revealed that Heidi had no idea they were in financial trouble. Nick handled all the bills and had kept the foreclosure a secret from his wife. The case went unsolved for several years. In 2012, Nick remarried. His new wife, Rachel Firkus, later told 2020 that she initially felt bad for her husband over the trauma of losing Heidi, but she discovered and noticed that they were late on their property taxes and were facing foreclosure, something Nick had not told her about, and began to see a pattern of behavior that made her suspect that her husband may have been involved in Heidi's murder. In addition to being reckless with money, Nick was a habitual liar to the point where he lied about things that it made no sense to lie about. Not wanting to be Nick's next victim, Rachel divorced Nick and began speaking with law enforcement about Heidi's case. In the meantime, the FBI got involved and re-examined some of the evidence in hopes of spotting something that was missed during the initial investigation. In 2021, authorities concluded that they finally had enough evidence to arrest Nick and charged him with murder. He stubbornly maintained his innocence throughout his trial, and even after he was found guilty, and he continued to receive support from his friends and family throughout the trial. Nick Firkus was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Number 1. Brandon Thiesfeld. During the summer of 2019, 21-year-old University of Mississippi student Ali Costiel was mercilessly gunned down from behind at an abandoned fishing camp called Sardis Lake. Lafayette County investigator Jarrett Bundren later told 48 Hours that he had never seen a victim with so many gunshot wounds in his career. She was struck 9 times. Although Ali's phone was nowhere to be found, sheriff's deputies were able to track her text messages through her Apple Watch. It revealed that Ali had recently told a fellow student, Brandon Thiesfeld, that she thought she might be pregnant with his baby. She had also sent him a photo of an inconclusive pregnancy test. The two had a complicated relationship going back 3 years and hadn't seen each other in a few months. Ali wanted to meet up and talk, but Thiesfeld responded to the news of the possible pregnancy by telling her that he wasn't interested in meeting and urging her to get an abortion. He said a baby would ruin both their lives and that there was no way he could become a parent at that time. Then, after refusing to meet up with Ali repeatedly, Thiesfeld texted the young woman and asked if they could get together and talk. She was found dead the next morning. Further evidence linked him to the crime, and he was arrested for murder. Thiesfeld maintained his innocence, but the more police learned about his relationship with Ali, the more their suspicions grew. People who knew the young man described him as misogynistic, while Ali's friends recalled hearing stories about the outright degrading things he said to her. Most people agreed that Ali wanted a serious relationship, but that Thiesfeld wasn't interested in one. In fact, the two had never officially dated, despite their ongoing involvement with one another. Speaking with 48 Hours, Ali's friends and family described how she hoped to meet a Southern boy while away at college, preferably a future husband who she could see herself someday having kids with. She limited what she shared about Thiesfeld, but it was clear after she met him in 2016 that she was smitten. Perhaps she was blinded by love and continued to see Thiesfeld as the Southern gentleman she had been looking for, even after it became clear that he wasn't the right person for her. Regardless of what kept the two coming back to one another for more, it ended in needless tragedy with one life taken and another ruined. Thiesfeld pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison. He apologized to Ali's family in court but never revealed his motive, leaving her loved ones to speculate that he wanted to make sure that she didn't have his baby.
If your best friend was on probation and got caught with something illegal while you were hanging out together, would you consider sparing them from a lengthy prison sentence by taking credit for their stash, even if it came with the risk of a possible conviction on your record and a few months in jail? Let us know in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.